Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great honor to speak to this gathering. I apologize, I am English, I don't speak Spanish. I will do my best to speak clearer English than most of my contemporaries and compatriots do. Murdering the English language has become quite a thing in Britain. Okay, the current slowdown, an historical perspective. Let me start with the idea that we have at the moment a new productivity paradox. A few of you may remember Solo's productivity paradox of the 1980s, when he said you can see the computer age everywhere except in the productivity statistics. Well, perhaps you can see the fourth industrial revolution everywhere except in the productivity statistics at the moment. And yet, there is a paradox. People think that technology is advancing very rapidly at the same time that we've seen this slowdown in productivity growth. And I'm going to argue that it is a real slowdown. It's not some artifact of the way the data are constructed. And yet, we also got great excitement, possibly fear, about artificial intelligence, robotics. The robots are coming to take all our jobs. I look forward to this, really. In my old age, I'm hoping there will be a robot that can mow my lawn, make my cup of tea, and so on. But I can see that there is apprehension out there as well. Okay. Let's start with a few numbers, if I may. Growth rates in different periods. Y upon P here means GDP per person. Y upon HW means GDP per hour worked. So our measure of productivity is actually GDP per hour worked. It's the Y upon HW column. If we compare the United States and the EU 15, we see that in the golden age, so-called, of European growth in the 1950s and 60s, European Union countries typically grew much faster than the United States. They were catching up. As time goes on, productivity growth in Europe has tended to slow down period by period until in the recent past we see a very low productivity growth rate, 0.6% per year. And that is actually inferior to what we've seen in the US, but its performance is quite disappointing as well. If we look to the possible future, look what the authorities are saying, what the people who have to consider this for economic policy reasons are saying. The European Commission is essentially saying that productivity growth will probably pick up from the low levels of the crisis years and so on, but will only, in their view, for these countries, be about 1.1% per year over the decade of the 2020s. And the US productivity is also only expected to tick up a little bit by the Congressional Budget Office, who have the responsibility to produce official pronouncements on these things. Looking at that in words, there we have the experience I've just described in numbers put in words. Going down to the bottom of that, productivity growth is looking slow in the years since about the start of the financial crisis. And the question then in the 2020s is, will Europe still be struggling to keep up with this sluggish growth in the United States? The way I tend to think about this experience is to say quite a large part of what happens here is Europe responding to technological improvement in the United States. I think it must be true here, but in the UK we know as well. In the UK we know that more than 90% of our technological progress is essentially imported. It's essentially technology transfer, and a very large part of that comes from the US. In future, at some point, politics permitting, it may come from China, We are looking at that with interest in the UK just at the moment, but that's another story. But right now, I think the way one would think about productivity futures over the next decade or so is to ask ourselves, is the productivity slowdown in the United States permanent, or will the US likely pick up and Europe then be able to follow in the footsteps by importing technological improvements in particular? Well, that leads us to think about future total factor productivity growth in the leader. I've summarized that, shorthanded that as TFP growth. And it's very interesting if you look at the people who think they know, their opinions vary hugely. Robert Gordon will be a name known to quite a lot of people here, I think. He produced a pretty famous book in 2016. If you work through it, the implied forecast for TFP growth over the period, say, from when he wrote to about 2030 or 2035, I make his projection to be about 0.4% a year. That's probably tantamount to saying that labour productivity growth will be well below 1% a year. Now, I can see one or two people frowning at that, so you should. If the world turns out like that, that's not really very good news for us, I think. So let's go down one row. Eric Brynjolfsson is perhaps the biggest cheerleader at the moment for what I would call techno optimism, that new technology is just around the corner, which is going to transform productivity performance. In his 2014 book with McAfee, I would infer from what they said in that book that they're thinking total factor productivity growth might be about 2% a year. And in that case, labour productivity growth might be about 3% a year, I suggest. That's really rather nice. I think we can smile at that one and think that this is a much more rosy future, if you like. Some of my best friends are econometricians, so I don't think I can go without mentioning what the econometricians have to say. Generally speaking, econometricians are very pessimistic at the moment, or pretty pessimistic. When they analyze what has been happening to trend productivity growth, they basically say trend growth has decreased and decreased quite a lot. Antolin Diaz paper in the Review of Economic Statistics puts American trend TFP growth at about 0.4% a year. So that's more or less siding with Gordon and saying it's a trend, it's going to continue. But as always, we can find a more optimistic view. And I would commend you the research of Alexopoulos and Cohen, which I think is not very well known at the moment, but is starting to get a kind of cult following. So let me recommend to you that it's interesting. They attempt to forecast TFP growth and explain past TFP growth using the amount of books on new technology which accrue in the catalogue of the Library of Congress. They show that, which is a copyright library, you have to deposit your book there in the US. They show that in the past that has a pretty good track record of, in effect, being a leading indicator of TFP growth shortly afterwards. They note that the book production really stalled, it flatlined from about the mid-1990s to about 2010, since when it has started to pick up. If I take their projection literally, I think they're even more optimistic than Brynjolfsson. 2.2% a year, I make it. So that, I think, is about as wide a range of views about the future as I can recall in my professional career. So, obviously, part of my job is quickly to say, or actually rather slowly to say, which I think is correct, or at least more correct. I don't know, you don't know, the markets don't know, but we could have a stab at trying to explain what we need to know to work out who's right. Those are some more econometric estimates, again, showing this rather pessimistic outlook compared with years ago. And I noticed that those big European economies, these are OECD estimates essentially, they seem to have lower trend productivity growth than they did, say, at the turn of the century. So the Europeans are, in a sense, according to this sort of analysis, indeed following the Americans. Okay, so if we wanted to resolve this new American productivity paradox, what possibilities are there? Well, one, which is canvassed quite a lot by Brynjolfsson, is that actually the problem is measurement, that we're actually doing much better than we think we are. Well, that cheers us up quite a lot, I think. And they are arguing, and I'll come back to this in a moment, that essentially the digital revolution has made it much harder to measure GDP accurately, and that actually we underestimate the rate of GDP growth, probably by quite a bit, according to them. To explain the slowdown, though, you might want to note that that problem has to have got much worse. It's not sufficient to say that we underestimate growth. Second thing, and as some of you will know, I love self-citation, so I'm going to get one in fairly early on here. Self-citation says, if you look back at trend productivity growth, and my co-author is an econometrician here, then actually trend growth, as you might estimate it, is typically a pretty poor predictor of what would happen over the following 10 years. In particular, you would have been extremely pessimistic at the start of the 1990s on what had been happening. Start of the 1990s, of course, is just when things got a lot faster. Productivity growth really jumped up in the context of information and communication technology. Solo's paradox disappeared. As Monty Python might have said, almost as soon as he'd said it, it was a deceased paradox. Okay, a rather weak joke, but making jokes is so dangerous these days. On the whole, I don't. That one's probably just about politically correct and allowable. Maybe parrots will object. Who knows? Okay, I think an interesting point, Brynjolfsson again is quite keen on this, is that general purpose technologies, the things which ultimately are very important for productivity, though I shall say in a few minutes not the be-all and end-all. In the past we think of steam, we think of electricity, we think of the internal combustion engine, big inventions which had a very wide application across the economy. I think what historical research shows there is that those big general purpose technologies of the past typically again have a lag. They are known before they really, or they're known to exist before they really affect economic performance. And the lag can be quite long. So the significant time lag point is certainly one that historically deserves some credibility. Robert Gordon is, however, more pessimistic. He basically thinks that actually there are no great inventions left. The great inventions were all in the past. Okay, well, we'll see whether you agree with that at the end of the hour. I have to say right from the outset that I do not believe that claim, but Gordon has advanced it repeatedly, and we'll have a word or two about it. The fifth one there, Nick Bloom and his colleagues, including some very high-profile growth economists, very, very well-known names, are among the OWL of Bloom et al., have a claim which says new ideas have become much harder to find. Now, that is deeply pessimistic because it is a permanent view of the future. The argument here is that you have to spend more and more and more on R&D to produce some sort of discovery. That, if you like, the productivity of the R&D sector has decreased, and decreased a lot. That this is decreasing really strongly as time goes on. And if that claim is correct and embedded in the sort of model that they have in mind, I think we're down to a projection of TFP growth at 0.2 or 0.25 or something like that. And then the intriguing one, which I think has not had a lot of European attention, but deserves to have and has some important lessons for, sorry I have to say this, you Europeans. I'm practicing for next week. I think this is a quite important lesson for you Europeans, is this claim that the United States is suffering from declining business dynamism. So this is essentially much less entry and exit. Schumpeter might have said much weaker creative destruction, if you wish. That there are fewer business startups, that weak producers take much longer to disappear, that the economy is not responding to entry opportunities very well, and so on. So that the technology may be there, or alternatively the technology may be starting to come through in the context of AI, but the economy is much less good at using the opportunity than it used to be. If that claim is true, we would need to understand where that decline in dynamism has come from, and it would be very important for you Europeans to avoid falling into this kind of trap. Okay, I won't dwell on this. Let me simply say I think the literature is pretty agreed on this, that the slowdown in the United States is not mismeasurement. There are a bunch of papers which I've referred to there. Generally speaking, economists in this club do agree that growth is underestimated, but they would say that has been true for the last several decades, and it's not got significantly worse. The problem in estimating growth of output, real output, and growth of, therefore, real productivity is measuring what the economist would call the GDP deflator. Well, it's measuring what's happening to prices, and that includes things like adjusting prices for quality change. Quality change is a very important part of technological progress, but it's a very big problem for the measurement analyst. It's also probably true that there are gains from the digital economy which show up in what economists traditionally would have called household production. They're not within the boundary of GDP, and on our conventional estimate they shouldn't be, but they do improve welfare. As I say, I won't dwell on that. You can come back to it later if you want. My own work with Mills, I've already summarized the conclusion that has. It basically is saying that American TFP growth has been very volatile and pretty hard to project or to predict using any kind of econometric time series model. The recent econometric estimates show a sizable fall. On the basis of that research which I did, I'd probably be wanting to say that if I'm a techno optimist, I wouldn't allow the econometricians to put me off a lot. Okay, we could come back to that. I've got to skip through a few slides here, I think, to get through the material. There is a little chart about the misprediction. The green curve, green wobbly line, basically shows the average of TFP growth over the next 10 years from the point that is plotted. The red and the blue lines are two of many estimates of trend growth which we ran, and you'll notice that trend growth estimates were declining pretty steadily, even though productivity was starting to leap forward in the 1990s. I've made that point already. General purpose technologies do indeed have quite a lag in their effect on the economy on many occasions in the past. Actually, ICT, probably less of a lag than, say, steam and electricity. It also is possible that a general purpose technology could be very important, have a long period in which it gets better, there's a cumulative impact which is significant, but at no point does it really have a very big effect on measured growth. I'll show you an example. These are estimates done using a growth accounting technique of the contribution of general purpose technologies in the past to labour productivity growth. The spectacular one there is, of course, the one that I did myself. There are some other estimates there, but the one at the top I did, that's, in case you can't read it, Crafts 2004, if you wish to go and chase up the reference. That's steam. If you look at those numbers, what you'll see is that as late as 1830, my best estimate is that steam power had made almost no difference to productivity growth in the British economy. Some of you remember James Watt, a famous pioneer. James Watt's improved steam engine was patented in 1769. So for the first 60 years after James Watt, productivity doesn't have massive effects. And if we look at those numbers, they're quite big, quite impressive in a way, because they're sustained over a fair period of time. But even, say, electricity, which is a powerful general-purpose technology, certainly doesn't, those numbers are not big enough to dominate what's happening in the American economy at the time. So I do think general-purpose technologies are important, but I don't think they completely dominate. In fact, they far from dominate overall productivity performance. So if we were to cheer ourselves up with the coming of the robots, in the productivity sense at least, that isn't, I think, going to be anything like a full move forward from the current productivity slowdown. And while we're talking about robots, what do the technology analysts say at the moment? Well, these are people who've actually looked at employment, looked at technology that's on the way, looked at, if you like, the possibility of automating or computerizing. They use different words, but I think they're all really after the same thing. Jobs, in some cases that's what they look at. In other cases they look at tasks. So a job might be made up of several tasks, some of which are more automatable than others, if you want to think about it like that. That's the sort of thing that you find in the current literature. The median OECD job, these are two OECD economists actually, has about a 48% chance, according to them, of being automated by 2005. That means about half the jobs in the economy have more than that chance of being automated. Quite a significant minority have a chance of 75% or more, according to this sort of research. An alternative estimate might be that 35% of the tasks done by the median job are automatable. If you look at what that could imply for productivity growth, I think you'd be probably saying that if this all happened within a horizon of about 15 to 20 years, then you'd probably get a boost to labour productivity growth of tops about 1.5% a year, which would be excellent in the context of our current issues and so on, but is not sort of an escape totally to the sunlit uplands. Sunlit uplands is a phrase which has a bit of resonance to a British person who's lived through Brexit, but it probably doesn't travel over here so well. This view then would be that there will be quite rapid productivity growth, and that we're currently in the delay that general purpose technologies actually have. A footnote to that slide: when you go into the details of those analyses, what's really interesting about them is the sort of jobs that go. And generally speaking, the suggestion is that it is low-wage, low-education workers who will really be in the forefront of losing those jobs, many of whom have been in the sheltered, non-internationally tradable sector of the economy previously. Crucial issue will be how good European economies are at redeploying those workers. Actually, what becomes central here, I think, is labour market policies as to how well we redeploy those workers and get them producing something different when perhaps the robot has taken what they did before. European Commission's growth projections, or some of them done recently, which I borrowed on an earlier slide, essentially have this rather sluggish, very sluggish productivity performance going through all the way at least to 2040. That's the not very cheerful chart. I'm going to cheer you up slightly on that. European Commission really isn't assuming any kind of boost from AI or robotics, at least nothing that isn't trivial. It takes a very cautious position on future productivity growth, it seems to me. Whereas if you were believing in a positive technology shock, similar perhaps to what happened in the United States 100 years ago, then that could make things look a bit different. Now, you might want to play with this idea at home. If you do, after the talk, there is an excellent website run by some economists from the Banque de France. Gilbert Sett is the name you'd associate with it. You can find this little toy at the website address which I've put at the bottom. What this allows you to do is, in effect, to simulate the consequences of your own assumption about what, let's call it AI, will do to future productivity growth. Here's one that they did, comparing secular stagnation, if nothing happens, with a positive technology shock, which is probably a bit bigger than what I've described the possible AI shock to be. Notice then, and incidentally, in column 2 rather than column 1 under the euro area, in column 2 there's a bit of structural reform taking place as well. So column 1's probably the one really to look at. The suggestion is that this could have quite a noticeable effect on productivity growth. Total factor productivity growth might be about double the projection that goes without the technology improvement. Gordon bases his analysis on the idea of the great inventions, story being that the great inventions were all made when he was a boy, that there won't be any more, and that they had a big effect on first raising American productivity growth and then seeing it decline. I think if you read the book carefully, there's very little evidence in it at all that the great invention story is either true about the past or a good projection about the future. I have put that in academic ease. These claims are not evidence-based and may be misconceived. I rather like to bring into the story, and I think it's quite important again for Europe, the work of Arnold Harburger. Harburger was very resistant to the idea of the general purpose technology as the whole story. He talked about productivity growth typically being a mushrooms process. Lots and lots of different sources of productivity improvement which grow sporadically all over the economy, like mushrooms in a field. You get the sort of the metaphor working through. I think that's actually quite a powerful and largely accurate vision of where productivity growth came from in the past. And I think it's at least possible to argue that our problem at the moment is we aren't growing enough mushrooms. Okay, I think that may be as far as that metaphor should go for the moment. If we went back to the 1930s and looked at a technologically progressive decade, then I and my colleagues, Gerben Bakker was the lead author on this paper, I'm there in Al, we had a look at where TFP growth came from in that decade when actually in the United States productivity moved forward a lot. We found it quite easy to convince ourselves at least that productivity growth was nowhere near dominated by great inventions. The great inventions paradigm, I think, is misleading. There is total factor productivity growth before the Second World War, and our best estimate of the impact of the great inventions does indeed say they're important, but they're nowhere near the whole story. If you were to look down at the bottom and look at the slowdown in productivity growth from about 2004, it's not really totally centered in the IT sectors. Also, quite a lot of it occurs in the rest of the economy. So I think ranging your story just around a general purpose technology is a mistake. Down to the fifth of the arguments, are ideas getting much harder to find? Bloom et al. Say, yes. We do more and more and more research intensity, but TFP growth gets weaker and weaker over time. They claim that the number of researchers has to double in the United States every 13 years just to maintain TFP growth. Half-life is 13 years, in other words. And they argue that, in effect, this means that the future will be one of very slow productivity growth. I mentioned that earlier. Is that view right? I think it's extremely questionable. Far too pessimistic for me, But then I've always been a bit of an optimist, a bit of a gambler and so on. If I wanted to challenge them, and I do, what might I say? Well, I'd say that TFP growth is not really a very good indicator just of technological progress. It refers to all sorts of other things like efficiency, the allocation of resources in the economy, and so on. So one way you might try and alternatively calculate this claim is to look at patenting. If you look at patenting per researcher, it has declined a little bit, but it's only declining very slowly. The half-life of patenting looks like nearly 200 years. And if you look at our friends with the technology books, there's no diminishing returns at all. If you want to be super optimistic, look at the bottom bullet point. Artificial intelligence may have the role of being the invention of a method of invention. What's that about? That's essentially about looking for needles in haystacks, if you like. Looking for very small needles in giant haystacks. Giant Haystacks was a famous wrestler in the UK. Clearly he didn't have much fame over here, or there would have been name recognition there. Essentially this is saying that a lot of our new ideas come from experimenting with testing things on data. They're inductive, if you like. If that is what you believe, surely that is what AI is really going to help us with. So that would be the claim here. And it would be the claim that technological progress in the R&D sector will actually solve this ideas getting harder to find problem. So there are actually some of the statistics that I dug up on patenting, on new tech books, and so on. You can look at those at your leisure later. The declining business dynamism is really an important and interesting story. If you look just at where productivity change has happened in the American economy, you can do a kind of accounting identity. And if you do it, this decomposition suggests that a good part, maybe nearly all, the slowdown in the economy could be accounted for by smaller contributions from entry and smaller redistributions of activity towards more productive firms, more, if you like, dynamic producers. That would clearly have a big omission in the story. It's an accounting identity. Even if it's true, the data are right, it doesn't tell you about causality. It doesn't tell you exactly what's happening. But it is quite an interesting story. So if there is that kind of problem, and that's masking the strength of productivity growth which could come in a better organized economy from technological change, what might be the reason? This is, I think, the frontier of the literature at the moment. It's advancing quickly. It's not reached a consensus, but there are some very interesting papers sitting there. What they amount to saying is, in particular, that competition has got much weaker in the American economy. Thomas Philippon has an excellent book called The Great Reversal. What he's actually saying is over most of the post-war period, up until the early years of this century, Europe had a very weak competition policy compared with the United States. Things have changed. The great reversal is that it's now the United States that has inefficient, weak, ineffective competition policy, and you Europeans have improved a great deal. Probably because competition policy is organized at the level of the EU, or administered at the level of the EU, rather than at the level of the nation state. That's quite an interesting claim. What Philippon shows, perhaps the most convincing piece of his evidence, is that the responsiveness of entry of new firms to a high value for Tobin's Q, that's basically asset prices telling you this is a very good sector in which to invest. That elasticity appears to have fallen to almost zero since the turn of the century. What's the story? The story, according to him, is that regulations have started to make it much more difficult to challenge incumbent firms. Entry costs have got much bigger, concentration is increasing, excess profits are increasing, and this is not good for competition leading to productivity improvement. Now that's quite interesting because it would be a story with very powerful policy implications, certainly for us on this side of the Atlantic, as well as for the Americans, and it would also perhaps help resolve the paradox of powerful powerful technology changes going with weak productivity. Okay, I've used up most of my time, I think. I was told I could have about 40 minutes. I make it, according to my clock, about 35 minutes at the moment. So perhaps, having teased you with all that, I'll have some conclusions at the end, but I can have a little detour into my home country, just for a moment or two. And the story here is we're doing worse than everybody, apart from possibly Finland, at improving productivity over the recent past. In the UK, we call this the UK productivity puzzle. ONS is the Office of National Statistics in the UK. It describes what's going on in terms of what I might think of as a counterfactual. If only productivity performance or trend productivity had been sustained after 2008 on the previous trend path, now output per worker would be about 18% higher than actually it is. My colleague Mills and I had a go at estimating this as well, and we came to a similar conclusion. It's about 20%, something like that. The really interesting feature for me as an economic historian about that, and I haven't fully worked out the story at all, but I'll give you a conjecture, is that I think this is really quite unusual. So if we look at this graph, this is rather similar to the one I showed you before. Namely, it says I'll estimate the trend at various points in the past, and I'll look what happens to growth over the next period compared with what I would have believed on the pre-existing trend. Look at the squiggle at the right-hand side. That is down close to 20%. I just told you that. There is no other entry on that chart which gets anywhere near 20%. The nearest is about 10% below the previous trend estimate. And you would have seen that at the end of the golden age in the UK, the fast productivity growth of the post-war years. And you would have seen it in something called the Victorian climacteric, it's a technical economic history phrase, in the late 19th century. Looking at the Great Depression, though, only about 5% below the previous estimate of the trend. So this really is a big, and I would argue unprecedented, productivity shock. And in the UK case, I really am not sure that we know what is going on. I mean, with regard to the productivity puzzle, I'm not describing the performance of our government. That's quite another story. Okay. No previous shock comes close is the key message there. Where might this problem have arisen? I don't know entirely. I do think there's an effect, which is a general purpose technology one in a sense, that the UK did very well out of information and communications technologies. The productivity growth coming from that has been reduced over the last years, and I can find references in those footnotes to generate the estimate that I've got there. The UK went through a big financial crisis that undoubtedly lowered productivity. It also resulted in the end of rapid productivity growth in the financial sector. We can argue about whether we can measure growth in the financial sector well or not, but on the basis of how it is actually measured according to the national accounts, there was a strong contribution from the financial sector up until the financial crisis, and it has then essentially disappeared. And then in the last 2.5, 3 years or so, I think Brexit joins in. We know that uncertainty, Brexit related, has reduced investment in the UK, And the paper by Bloom et al., different set of collaborators here, also suggests that managers' time has been hugely diverted from doing productive things to contingency planning about what sort of Brexit they might be faced with. Add those together, which is probably a bit misleading, and you do get close to 20%. So we're somewhere perhaps on the right track, but strictly, I think we should say it's still a puzzle. However, when I did do econometrics, I was always taught you should have an out-of-sample test of your hypothesis or argument, so I'll give you one. The 1930s, which you naive person in the street would think was surely worse than the recent past, as I showed you, surely wasn't worse than the recent past. What was different then? Well, there were strong new industries coming along. It was cars and electricity. We didn't have a banking crisis at all. Not a single bank failed in the UK in the 1930s. And we did very quickly, after leaving the gold standard, come up with a credible new macroeconomic policy regime. There was no equivalent of the Brexit uncertainty. So I think I could possibly spin you a yarn which was along the lines of, if I follow my conjecture back to the 1930s, perhaps I get some support. Now, having just changed my job, I'm emeritus, as was said at the start, at Warwick, and have joined new colleagues with a part-time retirement job at Sussex. Obviously, I've had to qualify in lecturing school again. The fact that I've been doing it for 49 years apparently counts for little. It doesn't tick the box as far as the bureaucrats are concerned. Okay, well, in ticking the box as far as the bureaucrats are concerned, going back to lecturing school, one of the lessons is always finish with conclusions. It's a good idea to do that because most of the audience will either have got lost or much more likely gone to sleep with the sort of boredom of the presentation and so on. So if either you got lost or much more likely you were asleep, or alternatively the translator didn't get it right, it's going to have another go, then here we are. My conclusion is that we really do not know what future American total factor productivity growth will be. We can probably narrow the range down. I think it's unlikely that we will be faced with something as pessimistic as Gordon or the ideas getting harder to find people suggest. I do think the evidence in favour of techno optimism is a bit more appealing than econometric backward-looking manipulation of the data. And I am willing to give some credibility, some credence to the idea that we may be partly waiting for the economic impact of a new general purpose technology. I do think the productivity slowdown is real there, and that has warning signs for Europe, very clearly. But quite likely, not only is it not necessarily permanent at the level we see at the minute, but quite possibly it's been exacerbated by serious policy errors. What are the errors I'm pointing to? The errors which have generated declining business dynamism. Declining business dynamism, I think, is rather like not growing enough mushrooms. So going back to my metaphor, I finish with the conclusion that we should aim to grow more mushrooms. Thank you.